Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Simon Gertzen and you're watching Simon Says at MTGOacademy.com. Today's topic is the Mulligan, but before we jump into this I want to show you a small game I made up. And the game is called Beat My Roll. You get two six-sided dice and I'm not going to show you the roll I did, but you just have to beat it by getting a higher sum. Now, after you've seen your result, you are allowed to reroll, and as a cost, you have to subtract 1 from your total. So, if we look at the probability distribution of the sum of two dice, we see that they form a triangular shape here, and we all know this from various games or interactions. So, what would we do to maximize our chances to win the above game? We would just try to land in the upper range of possible sums. And of course, if we roll a 2, we aren't going to be satisfied with that. And what happens there is that in the first roll, we are going to have an expected value of a 7. And each reroll is going to have an expected value of 1 less. So the first reroll has an expected value of 6, the second reroll has an expected value of 5, and so on. Now, this gives us a very easy strategy for the first reroll. If we have a 7 or higher, we are going to keep the roll, and if we have a 6 or lower, we are going to reroll. And we continue this and try to reach the highest possible value for our roll. Of course, we are highly favored to win this game against an average roll. Now, what does this have to do with Mulligan? Well, quite a bit. The rerolling part and mulligans are basically the same thing. We just have to think about the differences. Now, of course, you all know what a mulligan is. We can trade in our hand of 7 for a hand of 6 and continue by trading in our hand of 6 for a hand of 5 and so on. Now, this is foremost a way to reduce variance. If we land on the left side of the spectrum, of the quality spectrum of hands, we can decide that our expected value of a hand with a card less is actually higher than what we got dealt. Now, this is a complex decision. It's actually quite difficult to evaluate the quality of our hand, but also of an expected hand over all the possible hands with 1 card less. And what makes it even more difficult is that the correctness of our decision also depends on the range of hands our opponents could have. So if we know that our opponent is likely to have a very strong hand, we might want to aim for a better hand than we would usually settle for. And maybe if we know that our opponent is already down to 5 cards, so we expect him to have a lesser hand on average, this might also influence our decision. But why is mulliganing so difficult? Well, it's really hard, it's really tough to do all these evaluations objectively without letting your psyche play tricks on you, without getting too greedy when your opponent is down some cards or when you are only missing a single land. It's just not in human nature to be very objective when randomness is involved. And that's also the second point. Deciding in favor of a mulligan means that you have to trust in randomness to give you a better result than what you're looking at. So instead of accepting what you were dealt, you are going to rely on the same random procedure that failed you once again. And that's just a difficult decision from a psychological point of view, which is also the reason why a lot of players, and especially lesser players, don't mulligan enough. Now, let's try to simplify and visualize things. I'm only going to look at a 7-card hand compared to a 6-card hand, but of course the graphs are going to look very similar and the concepts are the same. Now, in fact, we would have to look at the nested decision or the nested quality of hands, because if we mulligan a 7-card hand, we are actually not only looking at the quality of a 6-card hand, but also considering that we still have the chance to go to a 5-card hand. But these effects are actually not that relevant. Now, if we have a 7-card hand, it's going to be drawn from some probability distribution of well, let's say quality. Even though we probably can't measure it, we still have a feeling of what a qualitative hand would be. You know, this portion here would be like the absolute best hands. It would be like the 12 of the die roll example. But what we are interested in is about the lower range of hands. What are the hands that we actually don't want? And this is where it's actually really important to see where the expected quality of a 6-card hand lies. And I think of this as, for example, drawing at random kind of rating, an ELO rating or a DCI rating for my hand. And if I happen to draw something which is actually much worse than my average 6-card hand, I have to do a mulligan. So in this case, it would be the whole range to the left of this expected quality of a 6-card hand. Now, if we do this with the arrows again, we would have the range of keepable hands to the right and the range of mulligan hands on the left. Of course, this assumes that this is like an infinite graph. Now, this still doesn't tell us where this line is. Where is this dividing point? But this is something which actually changes with every game. It changes depending on who is on the play, who's on the draw. It changes with the matchup. It changes with your opponent's range. And it also changes with the format. And that's another point I want to make. A format's power level can usually be measured by the gap in quality between 6 and 7-card hands. Now, the more powerful a format is, the more powerful 6-card hands are compared to 7-card hands. The less powerful a format is, the more severe are the consequences of mulliganing, the bad consequences of mulligan. Let's take an example. In Legacy, you'll often see Delver players or combo players or basically any kind of players mulligan to 5 because they know that there are enough cards and interactions and key cards in the matchup that they can safely or comparably safely go down to 5. Now, this is a limited series, and in limited we have a rather low power level, and that means that excessive mulligans are usually not going to be good for you. And that's also based on the power level, on the overall power level. The missing card or even missing cards are much harder to gain back through tempo or card advantage mechanisms than in more powerful formats. So there's really quite a lot at work here. And this leads me to my conclusion. We have to ask a lot of questions, and we have to try to be as objective as possible while still being realistic at what we can expect from our deck and from our opponent as well. So the key questions when mulliganing are, and the easy ones are the land count, because we don't want to screw off flood. The creature count is the next step. Can we play some creatures in the early game, or are we going to be inactive for a longer period of time? And is this something we consider bad or acceptable given where we are on the axis of aggression? Now, another question that's more important for constructed formats is key cards. If you are playing a combo deck and you keep a hand that just doesn't have any of your combo parts, which would be considered the key cards of your deck, then you are just better off mulliganing instead of keeping a hand that's very, very likely to not do anything or fizzle, as we say. Now, the last question would be the question of the matchup, and that's a little tougher to evaluate, but just like playing no creatures in the early game, it just might not be in your best interest to take on a certain role in a matchup if you know that you are only favored during the early to mid game, but your opponent is going to take over any long game. So keeping a slow hand in such a matchup would put you into the wrong role. And these decisions, when done wrong, do lead to a lot of lost games and matches. So I hope this helps you to circumvent some of this.